Lettre au Président de la République par Émile Zola à Monsieur Félix Faure, Président de la République. Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
me
President,
permettrez-vous, dans ma
allow me,
gratitude
in my
pour
gratitude
la
for the kind
bienveillante
welcome you
accueil
once gave
que
me,
vous m'avez fait un
to
jour,
be worried about your
d'avoir
rightful glory,
ressorti de
and to
votre
question
histoire
whether your star, so happy so far, is not threatened with the most shameful and the most indelible stain. You came out safe and sound from slander. You won over hearts. You appear radiant in the apotheosis of this patriotic celebration that the Russian alliance has been for France. And you are preparing to preside over the solemn triumph of our universal exhibition, which will crown our great century of work, truth and freedom. But what a stain of mud on your name, I was going to say on your reign, is this abominable Dreyfus affair. A council of war has just, by order, dared to acquit one by the name of Esterhazy, the supreme insult to all truth, to all justice. And it's over. France has this defilement on its cheek. History will write that it was under your presidency that such a crime against society could have been committed. Since they dared, I will too dare. The truth, I will say it, because I promised to say it, if justice through its regular channels did not say it full and whole. My duty is to speak. I don't want to be an accomplice. My nights would be haunted by the spectre of the innocent man who, far away, pays for, in the most dreadful of tortures, a crime he did not commit. And it is to you, Mr. President, that I will shout it, this truth, with all the strength and revulsion an honest man can summon. Knowing your integrity, I'm sure you don't know the truth, and to whom will I denounce the harmful muddiness of the real culprits, if it is not to you, the first magistrate of the country? First, the truth about the trial and the conviction of Dreyfus. A dangerous man, who led everything, did everything, was Lieutenant-Colonel Dupaty de Clam, then a simple major. He is the whole Dreyfus affair. We will not understand it until a fair investigation has clearly established his actions and responsibilities. He appears to be the shadiest and most complex of creatures, spinning outlandish intrigues, stooping to the deceits of cheap novels, complete with stolen documents, anonymous letters, meetings in deserted spots, mysterious women scurrying around at night peddling damning evidence. He was the one who came up with the scheme of dictating the text of the bordereau to Dreyfus. He was the one who had the idea of observing him in a mirror-lined room. And he was the one that Major Forzanetti caught carrying a shuttered lantern near the sleeping man, hoping to project a sudden flash of light onto his face, and thus surprising him into a confession in the agitation of waking. I need say no more. Let us seek, and we shall find. I am stating simply that Major Dupaty de Clam, as the officer of justice charged with the preliminary investigation of the Dreyfus case, is the first and the most grievous offender in the ghastly miscarriage of justice that has been committed. The bordereau had already been for some time in the hands of Colonel Sonder, head of the intelligence office, who has since died of a paralytic stroke. Information was leaked, papers were disappearing, as they continue to do to this day, and as the author of the bordereau was sought out, little by little, an a priori assumption developed that it could only have come from an officer of the General Staff, and furthermore, an artillery officer. This interpretation, wrong on both counts, shows how superficially the bordereau was analysed, for a logical examination shows that it could only have come from an infantry officer. Such an internal search was conducted. Handwriting samples were compared, as if this were some family affair, a traitor to be sniffed out and expelled from within the same office. And although I have no desire to dwell on a story that is only partially known, Major Dupaty de Clam entered on the scene at the first hint of suspicion of Dreyfus. From that moment on, he was the one who invented Dreyfus the traitor. The affair became his affair. He boasted that he would confound him and make him confess all. Oh yes, there was of course the Minister of War, General Mercier, a man of apparently mediocre intellect, and there were also the Chief of Staff, General de Boisdeffre, who appears to have yielded to his own obsession with religion, and the Deputy Chief of Staff, General Gans, whose conscience allowed for many accommodations. But in the end, it all started with Major du Paty de Clam, who led them on, hypnotised them, for, as an adept of spiritualism and the occult, he converses with spirits. No one would ever believe the experiments to which he subjected the unfortunate Dreyfus, the traps he set for him, the wild investigations, monstrous fantasies, the whole demented torture. Oh, that first trial! What a nightmare it is for all who know it in its true details. Major du Paty de Clam had Dreyfus arrested and placed in solitary confinement. He ran to Madame Dreyfus, terrorised her, telling her that if she talked to anyone, her husband would be ruined. Meanwhile, the unfortunate arrestee was tearing at his flesh and proclaiming his innocence. And this is how the case proceeded, like some 15th century chronicle shrouded in mystery, swamped in all manner of nasty twists and turns, all stemming from one childish allegation, that idiot Bordereau, which was not only a bit of vulgar trickery, but also the most outrageous swindle imaginable, for almost all of these notorious secrets turned out, in fact, to be worthless. Yes, I insist on this point, because this is the seed of it all, from which the true crime would later emerge, that horrifying denial of justice from which France is damaged. I would like to touch on how this judicial error was made possible, how it sprang out of the machinations of Major du Paty de Clam, how Generals Mercier, de Boisdeffre, and Gons became so ensnared in this falsehood piece by piece that they would later feel it necessary to impose it as holy and indisputable truth. To start with, there was nothing on their part but carelessness and lack of intelligence, but later they seem at worst to have given in to the obsessions with religion of their milieu and the prejudices of their class. In the end, they allowed stupidity to prevail. But now we see Dreyfus appearing before the court-martial. Behind the closed doors, the utmost secrecy is demanded. Had a traitor opened the border to the enemy and driven the German emperor straight to Notre Dame, the measures of secrecy and silence could not have been more stringent. The nation was astounded. There were whispers of the most horrible acts, of appalling treasons. The public naturally was taken in. No punishment could be too harsh. The people clamoured for the guilty man to be publicly stripped of his rank and demanded to see him writhing with remorse on his rock of infamy. Could these things be true? These unspeakable acts, these deeds so dangerous that they must be carefully hidden behind closed doors to keep Europe from going up in flames? No, they were nothing but the imagined, stupid stories of Major du Paty de Clam, all done to hide the most ridiculous of them. To be convinced of this, one need only read carefully the accusation as it was presented before the court-martial. How flimsy it is! The fact that someone could have been convicted on this charge is the ultimate iniquity. I defy decent men to read it without their hearts leaping with indignation and their crying out in revulsion, the thought of the undeserved punishment being meted out there on Devil's Island. Dreyfus knew several languages. A crime. No compromising papers were found at his home. A crime. He would occasionally visit his birthplace. A crime. He was hard-working and strove to be well-informed. A crime. He did not become flustered. A crime. He became flustered. A crime. And how childish the language is, how groundless the accusation. We also heard talk of 14 charges, but we only found one, the one about the Bordereau, and we learned that even there the handwriting experts could not agree. One of them, Monsieur Gobert, faced military pressure when he dared to come to a conclusion other than the desired one. We were told also that 23 officers had testified against Dreyfus. We still do not know what questions they were asked, but it is certain that not all of them implicated him. It should be noted, furthermore, that all of them came from the War Office. The whole case has been handled as an internal affair amongst insiders. And we must remember this. Members of the General Staff had sought this trial to begin with and judged it. And now they just passed judgment a second time. So all that remained of the case was the Bordereau, on which the experts had not been able to agree. It is said that within the council chamber the judges were naturally leaning towards acquittal. It becomes clear why at that point, as justification for the verdict. It became vitally important to turn up some damning evidence. A secret document that, like God, could not be shown, but which explained everything, and was invisible, unknowable, and incontrovertible. I deny the existence of that document. I deny it with all my strength. Some ridiculous note, maybe, about some little women wherein a certain D is mentioned, who was becoming too insistent, no doubt, some husband who felt he wasn't getting a good enough price for the use of his wife. But a document concerning national defence that could not be produced without sparking an immediate declaration of war tomorrow? No. No, it is a lie, all the more odious and cynical, and that its perpetrators are getting off free without even admitting it. They stirred up all of France, they hid behind the understandable reaction, they shut their mouths while troubling our hearts and perverting our spirit. I know of no greater crime against society. There, Mr. President, are the facts that explain how this miscarriage of justice came about. The evidence of Dreyfus's good character, his financial situation, his lack of motive, and his continued cries of innocence combine to show that he is the victim of the lurid imagination of Major du Paty de Clam, the religious circles surrounding him, and the dirty Jew obsession that is the scourge of our time. Now we come to the Esterhazy case. 3 years have passed, many consciences remain deeply troubled, and go on to become anxious, investigate, and end up convinced that Dreyfus is innocent. I shall not chronicle these doubts and the subsequent conclusion reached by Monsieur Schauer-Kessner, but while he was conducting his own investigation, major events were occurring at headquarters. Colonel Sonder had died, and Lieutenant Colonel Picard had succeeded him as head of the intelligence office. It was in this capacity, in the exercise of his office, that Lieutenant Colonel Picard came into possession of a telegram addressed to Major Esterhazy by an agent of a foreign power. His express duty was to open an inquiry. What is certain is that he never once acted against the will of his superiors. He thus submitted his suspicions to his hierarchical senior officers, first General Gans, then General de Boisdeffre, and then General Billot, who had succeeded General Mercier as Minister of War. That famous, much-discussed Picard file was none other than the Billot file, by which I mean the file created by a subordinate for his minister, which can still probably be found at the War Office. The investigation lasted from May to September 1896, and what must be said loud and clear is that General Gans was at that time convinced that Esterhazy was guilty, and that Generals de Boisdeffre and Billot had no doubt that the handwriting on the famous bordereau was Esterhazy's. This was the definitive conclusion of Lieutenant Colonel Picard's investigation. But feelings were running high, for the conviction of Esterhazy would inevitably lead to a retrial of Dreyfus, an eventuality that the General Staff wanted at all costs to avoid. That must have been a minute full of psychological anguish. Note that General Billot wasn't complicit thus far in anything. Newly appointed to his position, he could have found the truth. He did not dare, no doubt in terror of public opinion, certainly for fear of implicating the whole General Staff, General de Boisdeffre and General Gans, not to mention the subordinates. So, he hesitated for a brief moment of struggle between his conscience and what he believed to be the interest of the military. Once that moment had passed, it was already too late. He had committed himself, and he was compromised. From that point on, his responsibility only grew. He took on the crimes of others, he became as guilty as they. More guilty, for he was in a position to bring about justice, and did nothing. Can you understand this? For the last year, General Billot, Generals Gans and de Boisdeffre have known that Dreyfus is innocent, and they have kept this terrible knowledge to themselves. And these people sleep at night and have wives and children they love. Lieutenant Colonel Picard had carried out his duty as an honest man. He kept insisting to his superiors in the name of justice. He even begged them. He told them how impolitic their delays were in the face of the terrible storm that was gathering, which was bound to break when the truth was known. This was the language that Monsieur Schauer-Kessner later used with General Billot as well, appealing to his patriotism to take charge of the case so that it would not degenerate into a public disaster. But no, the crime had been committed, and the General Staff could no longer admit to it. And so, Lieutenant Colonel Picard was sent away on official duty. He was sent further and further away until he landed in Tunisia, where they tried eventually to reward his courage with an assignment that would certainly have seen him massacred, in the very same area where the Marquis de Moret had been killed. He was not in disgrace. Indeed, General Gans even maintained a friendly correspondence with him. It is only that there are secrets which must not come out. Meanwhile, in Paris, truth was marching on, inevitably, and we know how the expected storm broke. Monsieur Mathieu Dreyfus denounced Major Esterhazy as the real author of the bordereau, just as Monsieur Schauer-Kestner was handing over to the Minister of Justice a request for a retrial. This is where Major Esterhazy comes in. Witnesses say that he was at first in a panic, on the verge of suicide or running away. Then all of a sudden, emboldened, he surprised Paris by the violence of his attitude. Rescue had come, in the form of an anonymous letter warning of enemy actions, and a mysterious woman who had gone to the trouble one night of slipping him a paper stolen from headquarters that would save him. Here, I cannot help suspecting Lieutenant Colonel Dupaty de Clam, with the trademark fruits of his fertile imagination. His great achievement, Dreyfus's conviction, was in danger, and he surely was determined to protect it. A retrial would mean that the whole story, so extravagant, so tragic, with its disgraceful conclusion on Devil's Island, would fall apart. This he could not allow to happen. From then on, it became a duel between Lieutenant Colonel Picard and Lieutenant Colonel Dupaty de Clam, one with his face visible, the other masked. The next step would take them both to civil court. In the end, it came down to the General Staff protecting itself, not wanting to admit its crime, an abomination that had been growing by the hour. In disbelief, people wondered who Major Esterhazy's protectors were. First of all, behind the scenes, Lieutenant Colonel Dupaty de Clam was the one who had concocted the whole story, who kept it going, showing his hand with his ridiculous methods. Next, General Dubois d'Effre, then General Gans, and General Billot himself were all pulled into the effort to get the Major acquitted, for acknowledging Dreyfus's innocence would make the War Office collapse under the weight of public contempt. And the astounding outcome of this appalling situation was that the one honest man involved, Lieutenant Colonel Picard, who alone had done his duty, was to become the victim, the one who was ridiculed and punished. O justice, what terrible despair grips our hearts! It was even claimed that he himself was the forger, that he had fabricated the letter telegram in order to destroy Esterhazy. But good God, why? To what end? Find me a motive. Was he too being paid off by the Jews? The best part of it is that Picard was himself an anti-Semite. Yes, we have before us the ignoble spectacle of men lost in debts and crimes being hailed as innocent, whereas we attack the honour of a man whose life is spotless. A society that sinks to that level has fallen into decay. The Esterhazy affair, thus, Mr. President, comes down to this. A guilty man is being passed off as innocent. For almost 2 months, we have been following this nasty business hour by hour. I'm being brief, for this is but the abridged version of a story whose sordid pages will someday be written out in full. And so we have seen General de Pellier and then Major Ravery conduct an outrageous inquiry from which criminals emerged glorified and honest people sullied. And then a court-martial was convened. How could anyone expect a court-martial to undo what another court-martial had done? I'm not even talking about the possible issue of selection of judges. Doesn't the overriding idea of discipline, which is the lifeblood of these soldiers itself, undercut their capacity for fairness? He who demands discipline demands obedience. When the Minister of War, the Commander-in-Chief, proclaims in public, and to the acclamation of the nation's representatives, the absolute authority of a previous verdict, how can you expect a court-martial to rule against him? It is a hierarchical impossibility. General Billot directed the judges in his preliminary remarks, and they proceeded to judgment as they would to battle, unquestioningly. The preconceived opinion they brought to the bench was obviously the following. Dreyfus was found guilty for the crime of treason by a court-martial. He, therefore, is guilty, and we, a court-martial, cannot declare him innocent. But we know that acknowledging Esterhazy's guilt would be tantamount to proclaiming Dreyfus innocent. Nothing could get them around this. So they rendered an iniquitous verdict that will never cease to weigh upon our courts-martial and will henceforth cast a shadow of suspicion on all their decrees. The first court-martial was perhaps unintelligent. The second one is inescapably criminal. Their excuse, I repeat, is that the Supreme Chief had spoken, declaring the previous judgment incontrovertible, holy, and above mere mortals. How then could subordinates contradict it? We are told of the honour of the army. We are supposed to love and respect it. Ah, yes, of course. An army that would rise at the first threat, that would defend French soil, it is the people themselves, and for it we have nothing but devotion and respect. But this is not about that army, for whom we want only dignity in our need for justice. What it's about is the sword, the master that will, tomorrow perhaps, fall upon us. Kiss devoutly the hilt of that sword, that God? No. As I have shown, the Dreyfus case was a matter internal to the War Office. An officer of the General Staff, denounced by his co-officers of the General Staff, sentenced under pressure by the Chiefs of Staff. Once again, he could not be found innocent without the entire General Staff being guilty. And so the office, by all means imaginable, by press campaigns, by official communications, through influences, covered up for Esterhazy only to condemn Dreyfus a second time. Ah, what a good sweeping out the government of this republic should give to that Jesuit layer, as General Billot himself calls it. Where is it that truly strong, judiciously patriotic administration that will dare to clean house and start afresh? How many people I know who, faced with the possibility of war, tremble in anguish knowing to what hands we are entrusting our nation's defence. And what a nest of low intrigue, gossip and destruction that sacred sanctuary that decides the nation's fate has become. We are horrified by the terrible light the Dreyfus affair has cast upon it all. This human sacrifice of an unfortunate man, a dirty Jew. Ah, all that madness and stupidity was stirred up there. Preposterous fantasies, corrupt police tactics, inquisitorial, tyrannical practices. What petty whims of a few higher-ups trampling the nation under their boots, ramming back down their throats the people's cries for truth and justice, with the travesty of state security as a pretext. It is a crime to have relied on the foul press, let alone to have left his defence to the worst scoundrels of Paris, who are now gloating over the defeat of justice and plain truth. It is a crime to accuse of troubling France those who want to see her generous and at the head of nations, free and just, when it is they themselves who weaved a plot to impose this error on the entire world. It is a crime to mislead public opinion, to use that opinion for death-dealing machinations and imposed delirium. It is a crime to poison the minds of the meek and the humble, to stoke the passions of reactionism and intolerance by sheltering behind odious anti-Semitism, from which the great and liberal France will die if it is not cured. It is a crime to exploit patriotism in the service of hatred, and it is finally a crime to make the sword the modern god, at a time all humane science is working towards the achievement of truth and justice. That truth, that justice, for which we have so ardently longed for, how terrible it is to see them trampled, unrecognised and ignored. I suspect there must be a collapse taking place in the soul of Monsieur Charles Kestner, and I believe indeed that one day he will feel sorry for not having revealed, when questioned by the Senate, the whole story and thrown it all down bare. A man of honour, as he had been all his life, he believed that the truth would speak for itself, especially since it appeared to him plain as day. What good would it be to stir up trouble, especially since the sun would soon shine? It is for this serene trust that he is now being so cruelly punished. The same goes for Lieutenant Colonel Picard, who, guided by the highest sentiment of dignity, did not wish to publish General Ganc's correspondence. These scruples are all the more honourable since he remained respectful of discipline, while his superiors were dragging his own name through the mud and casting suspicion on him in the most astounding and outrageous ways. There are two victims, two brave men, two simple hearts, who left their fates to God while the devil was taking charge. Regarding Lieutenant Colonel Picard, even this ignoble deed was perpetrated. A French tribunal allowed the statement of the case to become a public indictment of one of the witnesses, Picard, accusing him of all sorts of wrongdoing. It then chose to prosecute the case behind closed doors as soon as that witness was brought in to defend himself. I say this is yet another crime, and that this crime will stir consciences everywhere. These military tribunals have, decidedly, a most singular idea of justice. Such is the plain truth, Mr. President, and it is terrifying. It will leave a stain on your presidency. I realise that you have no power over this case, that you are a prisoner of the Constitution, entourage. You have nonetheless your duty as a man, which you should recognise and that you should fulfil. It is not, moreover, that I despair any less of the triumph of right. I repeat with the most vehement conviction, truth is on the march, and nothing will stop it. Today is only the beginning, for it is only today that the positions have become clear. On one side, those who are guilty, who do not want to see light shed on things. On the other, those who seek justice and who will give their lives to attain it. I said it before, and now I say it again. When truth is buried underground, it grows and it builds up so much force that the day it explodes, it blasts everything with it. We shall see only too well whether we have been setting ourselves up for the most resounding of disasters. But this letter is long, Mr. President, and it is time for me to conclude it. I accuse Lieutenant Colonel du Paty de Clam of being the diabolical creator of this miscarriage of justice. Unknowingly, I'm willing to believe, and of defending this sorry deed over the last 3 years by all manner of bizarre and evil machinations. I accuse General Mercier of complicity, at least by mental weakness, in one of the greatest iniquities of the century. I accuse General Billot of having held in his hands absolute proof of Dreyfus's innocence and concealing it, thereby making himself guilty of crimes against mankind and against justice, as a political expedient and a way for the compromised General Staff to save face. I accuse General de Boisdeffre and General Gans of complicity in the same crime, the former no doubt out of religious prejudice, the latter perhaps out of that esprit de corps that has transformed the War Office into an unassailable holy ark. I accuse General de Pellier and Major Ravery of conducting a fraudulent inquiry, by which I mean a monstrously biased one, as attested by the latter in a report that is an imperishable monument to naive insolence. I accuse the 3 handwriting experts, Messieurs Billot, Varinard, and Couard, of having submitted reports that were deceitful and fraudulent, unless a medical examination finds them to be suffering from a disease of both eyesight and judgment. I accuse the officers of war of having used the press, particularly Leclerc and the Paris Echo, to conduct an abominable campaign to mislead public opinion and cover up their own wrongdoing. Finally, I accuse the first court-martial of violating the law by convicting the accused on the basis of evidence that was kept secret, and I accuse the second court-martial of covering up this illegality on orders by committing the judicial crime of acquitting a guilty man with full knowledge of his guilt. In making these accusations, I am aware that I am making myself liable to Articles 30 and 31 of the July 29, 1881 law on the press making liable a punishable offence. I expose myself voluntarily to that risk. As for the people I am accusing, I do not know them, I have never seen them, and I bear them neither ill will nor hatred. To me they are mere entities, agents of harm to society. The action I am taking is no more than a radical measure to hasten the explosion of truth and justice. I have but one passion, that of light, in the name of humanity which has suffered so much and is entitled to happiness. My fiery protest is nothing more than the cry of my very soul. Let them dare, then, to bring me before a court of law and investigate in the full light of day. J'attends. I am waiting.
Veuillez agréer, Monsieur le
Respect,
Président,
Mr. President.
l'assurance de
Émile
mon
Zola.
profond respect. Émile Zola.